You're about to listen to an excerpt of Secret City Geek Lab broadcast on KTSTFM.com every Wednesday at 7 o'clock p.m. For more news, reviews, and interviews from the world of geek, visit the Geek Lab at secretcitycomedy.com/geeklab or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/secretcity. Enjoy the show. From the Stanley Comikaze Expo, the Writing for Animation 101 panel. This panel took place at the Stanley's Comikaze Expo in Los Angeles. If you've ever wanted to be a writer for animation or want to know the difference between writing for animation and regular television and movies, this is the panel for you. We're going to hear from writers Dan Whitsman, who is currently the writer of Sabrina, Secrets of a Teenage Witch on the Hub channel, Rich Vogel, the writer of Batman, Superman, Smurfs, Muppet Babies, and Transformers, and Craig Miller, writer of Real Ghostbusters and G.I. Joe. These are very experienced veteran writers, and they have a lot of insight into how to become a writer and how to do it right. So let's get into that panel right now.
Good morning. Good morning. This is the Writing Animation 101 panel. And I'm going to ask the audience a couple questions first, then we'll get to introductions and get into talking about it. And my first question for you is, how many of you have worked in the animation industry? A few, okay. I think I've worked with that guy. Good. Anyway, how many of you have written professionally, animation or otherwise? Okay, just curious. Okay, we'll start with introduction. I'm going to start at the far end, and this is the easy part. Our first one is Dan Whitsman, who will now tell you a little about himself.
Hey there, I'm Dan. I'm part of a husband and wife writing team. Occasionally I get to play the husband. My wife and I have recently been working on the animated show Sabrina, Secrets of a Teenage Witch, which started broadcasting last month on the Hub channel. That was a lot of fun to write. And we've written for a lot of other TV shows, live action and animation, including Thomas the Tank Engine, and we co-wrote an animated feature film as well called The Magic Crystal.
You can tell he's not from around here. Brooklyn, I think.
If you need translation, don't be afraid to ask.
I'm Rich Vogel. I've been writing animation for a very long time. Worked on Batman, Superman, Justice League. Also worked on Smurfs, Muppet Babies, Winnie the Pooh, Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, Transformers. Just about anything that's warped your childhood, I've probably had a hand in.
Okay, and excuse me, my name's Craig Miller. And I started in a different end of the entertainment industry completely. I was a publicity and licensing executive before most of you were born on Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back and Dark Crystal and Muppets Take Manhattan and lots of other movies that you adore. Then I got into writing animation probably before most of you were born still. Real Ghostbusters, the Bionic Six, the Smurfs, Beast Wars, G.I. Joe, Curious George, all kinds of different things. And we're going to talk about writing animation. And I've done this panel before, and I think what will be more interesting to you rather than our just rambling around and maybe getting to topics you're interested in is I'm going to ask for questions from the beginning so that we can get so we can answer exactly what it is you want to hear about rather than telling you about things you're not interested in. So now that you know who we are, please, any questions? What do you want to know about animation? General questions, specific questions? Don't describe the specific property you've created and want to sell, but just about working in the industry, writing animation, that sort of thing. And the woman in the back had her hand up first.
So when you're going into the industry, the first thing that you're writing, are you usually working for a company or writing someone else's ideas? Because I know that you sometimes change it to the theater.
I mean, jump in, guys, or...
Yeah, I mean, I think typically, unless they snag you out of art school, which, quite frankly, happens more frequently at this point, where if you've done like a senior thesis project that they want to develop into a series, then suddenly you're working on your own project. But more typically, it's like you're going to come in and you're going to work on something that's already been established and it's not your character.
Yeah, most of the time. I do a lot of work developing, and I have created original shows. I've created far more of them than have actually been produced, but I've created shows that have been produced, and I get hired a lot to take properties and develop them into TV shows, book properties or toy properties. But most often when you're writing scripts, yeah, you're hired to write something that someone else created.
And you should see the pluses of that, not just the everyone wants. Okay, we all want to create our own shows. We all want to create our own movies. That's exciting. That turns us on. But when you're writing on a property that somebody else created, it's not like being asked to wear someone else's underpants around for the day. It's you can see. Even
well, not quite anyway.
Yeah, usually. There's a great excitement in coming into a world. I loved writing Sabrina the Teenage Witch. I wouldn't have come up with that show myself. But taking your creativity and what makes you exciting in an individual, and then wielding it within that box that someone else has created. And even if you're writing in the box, there's a huge difference between any show that you love. There's a huge difference between a really well-written episode of it and a crappy episode of it. So there's a lot of space and a lot of scope to do cool things, even if you're kind of a gun for hire writing on something that you didn't originate. So don't look down on that. And everyone, most people who end up creating original shows, at some point they worked, they learned a lot of stuff. They got to meet people working on someone else's show. And if a show has 26 episodes or 52 episodes or something like Curious George that runs and runs and runs, there's so much to learn just being involved.
And it's all about what you as an individual bring to that idea. It's a concept. It's like basketball or baseball or anything else. It's what you as an individual writer, an individual artist, an individual player bring to it that makes it different. And that's why when I did a show I created called Pocket Dragon Adventures, we did 104 11-minute episodes. Played in this country is 52 half hours, in other countries in quarter hours. But I wrote about 26 of them, and my business partner wrote 26 of them, and then we hired 30 other writers to write the rest of them, because you only have so many ideas, especially on a short schedule. Give me 10 years, I could come up with thousands, but in 6 months, 100 different stories about the same characters. Different people bring different ideas, different ways of telling stories, that sort of thing. So that's part of the business and part of the magic of it, is you bringing what you have into this other world.
Yeah, because having those other points of view and ideas fills out the world a lot more than you could on your own. It'll bring a reality and a depth to the characters that even though you created it, it'll surprise you along the way and make it more than it was.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Other questions? Yes, my insect friend.
Okay. So I was just wondering, what are some of the differences you keep in mind from writing for a live action to writing for an animation or something like that?
Yeah, well, this is the cool thing about animation, that crazy stuff is as easy or as hard to do as regular stuff. So if you're shooting a regular show live action, then having a boy walking along is a lot easier to shoot than having a troll walking along or a giant walking along, because you just get a boy, you shoot him. And if you want the giant or the troll, then you've got to start messing around with prosthetics and special effects and all this kind of stuff. But in a world where nothing is real to start with, and it's being drawn by somebody, or it's being a figure created in a computer by somebody, then hey, it's just as easy or just as hard to do a dragon as it is to do a bunch of kids say, hey, let's do the dragon. So that's what I love about animation. You get to do all kinds of crazy stuff.
Yeah, I think one difference is that writing animation is more like writing feature films in that you're writing very visually, you're writing action, you're telling the story through action and stuff like that. A lot of sitcom writers sometimes have a hard time adapting to writing animation because they think verbally, and you need to primarily think visually when you're writing animation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's pretty much the point I was going to make. You have to. You can't have you can't do My Dinner with Mickey. You can't do two people sitting in a room talking and cut from one face to another. In live action, you can. In animation, it's deadly. For some reason, no one knows exactly why. You can make there are theories, but basically, just staying on someone's face talking doesn't work. People will turn it off. You have to have stuff going on. There has to be movement in animation. You have to think about what's going on and what the scene is. And a lot of, especially television, even dramas, is a lot of standing around and talking. And you can't do just that in animation.
Right, and it doesn't mean that it has to be like things constantly moving or something like that. I mean, you look at some things like that are done with a very limited budget. There's something in the design that's interesting to watch, and there's something in the sort of world that they create that draws you in without necessarily having like things blowing up all the time. But when you get in trouble, then you blow things up.
Yeah. More questions. We can just yammer, but I'd rather answer your questions. John Wall.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges I face when writing is properly describing an action scene. Do you have any advice?
I'm sorry, describing what?
Action scenes or action. Do you have any advice on how to properly portray like an idea and detail something with a lot of action in it?
Yeah, one of the tricks that I use in writing it is try and only describe one thing at a time. In other words, if you've got a shot that's got 15 things going on in it, it's not going to be able to be visualized on the screen. So concentrate on what's important in the action. In one line, describe what the key thing is, and then in the next line, the next thing. But you're only doing one thing at a time. You're showing it. So you're thinking sort of like the camera, which is showing you this is happening, and then it's showing this is happening. And when you put that together in sequence, then you get your whole action sequence.
Right. I mean, think about you've watched this scene in a movie. Now you're telling your friend about it. How would you tell your friend about it? Well, there was this guy who did this, and then the other guy, and then you've got to be a little more specific so they know who to draw, or in live action which character it is. But you just describe it so someone can visualize it. And that's kind of an important thing in all writing for TV and movies. You can't visualize someone thinking about something. If you don't have it said or done, it isn't on the screen, and the audience won't know what's happening. You have to visualize, you have to put everything into the visual or auditory medium so that the audience knows what it is.
Except there's that cool episode of The Big Bang Theory when Raj and Sheldon are just looking at the equations on the board, and it's like, but the camera goes dun, 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 to show they're really thinking exciting stuff, but they're just looking. But the other thing is, read some scripts. You don't have to invent how to do it for yourself. Read some animation scripts. If you want to read some TV animation scripts, one place you can do it is on Jeffrey Scott's website. I think it's jeffreyscott.tv. He puts some of his Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle scripts up there, and they're really good to read. He has a book writing for animation. I think he does something which is a little bit old school. Sometimes he puts camera directions like angle on this, pan on that, which nowadays some directors don't like because you're treading on their territory as a writer. But apart from that, those scripts are they're great. You can see how and something like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is full of action.
Animation used to be written what's called full script. You called out literally every shot. close up on Fred, cut to Sam, camera pans over to Sally. You were directing it on paper.
Yeah, and I used to call that writing in self-defense.
Yeah, now, particularly on CG shows, you really don't do that kind of detailed camera calls. Unless there's something very important. That doesn't mean you don't describe the action. It just means you don't say specifically what the camera is looking at,
Right.
unless it's
this
very
is a
important.
close-up. This is
Right. You let the director, and in TV animation, a lot of directors are really just timing. But the storyboard artists, you let them figure it out within the script.
Yeah, I mean, there's one other thing that, I was talking earlier about writing visually. A really good exercise is to watch some of your favorite films with the sound off. Just watch it and absorb how the storytelling is being done visually, because that's what you're trying to describe in your script.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you have advice on character development versus story development, like putting in the character's quirks or developing them as just a personality versus not interfering with the actual show itself as you're doing that?
Well, the thing to remember to start with is that all storytelling is character. It isn't about what happens. It's about who your characters are, what they want, why they want it, and how they react to things. And everything has to be told true to who that character is. The example I always use is from Raiders of the Lost Ark, which isn't animation, but it still applies. Near the climax, the Nazis are taking the Ark and Marion up to open the Ark, and Indy comes up over the hill with a bazooka and says, "Give me the girl or I'll blow up the Ark." And Belloc, the evil archaeologist, says, Indy, remember, this is history." And we can go into it longer, but I want to keep this short. He reminds them that the Ark is a historical relic and that he and Indy are all about history. But go ahead, do what you want. Because he knows that Indy is all about history and preserving it and would never be able to blow up the Ark, and Indy surrenders. But put any Arnold Schwarzenegger character up on top of that hill, and Belloc would say, "You can't blow it up," and Arnold would say, "Like hell I can't," and he would blow up the Ark, race down the hill, grab Marion, and run off, because that would be true to his character. Who the character is has to propel the story.
When would it be okay to break what the character would usually do? Like, when would it be okay to have Indy break the Ark? Like, how do you know when you've reached the point where that's acceptable?
What do you mean, have him act against
Who he's displayed?
I think, you guys can jump in too, but I think it's when he's pushed when his back's to the wall, when something says, you have to do something other than what you would normally do.
Okay, but I would say he's still in character. That what you're looking at is what are the things of value to him, and is something more valuable to him than the Ark, then it would do that. So the character is never going to go against who they are, but you may put them into situations where they have to make a distinction that will refine your understanding of that character.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They would still be in character, but they're pushed to a point where they have to do something that they wouldn't do under normal circumstances. There has to be a reason for them to act against their normal needs and desires.
You think about characters who you really love, and aspects of them. Some characters that stick out for us because they're very something. They're kind of extreme. Indiana Jones, he's not a little bit heroic and a little bit knowledgeable about history. He's really heroic and really knowledgeable about history. Sheldon in The Big Bang Theory, he's not a little bit abstract or unable to read human emotions. He's really pushed. So that's one thing that makes characters memorable for us, when they're really pushed one way. Another thing, but what you're talking about, characters are interesting to us when they've got contradictions, when they're they've got conflicts in who they are. Like the other day I was rewatching some Battlestar Galactica. I love Battlestar Galactica. I have a bit of a thing for President Roosevelt as well. And
I thought it was orange green.
it's generational. She's like the decent like president. We've got to protect the civilians. You know, this isn't all a military operation. We've lost the war against the We've got to protect. And then one episode is like, that admiral, she's a bitch. You got to kill her. So she's like, so this woman who's all about human rights and protecting everyone and respecting the, she says to Commander Adama, that admiral, she's going to leave this room. You got to assassinate her. And it's kind of true to her character in one way, because the reason she wants to do that is to protect everyone, because she can see it's trouble. But in another way, it's just completely alien. You know, this woman who was all about decency and the law, and she just put a bullet in her head. And that's fascinating when someone has got those internal contradictions. And then they can do something, exactly what you were saying, which is act in a way that's completely different from what they normally do. And that's really, really exciting when a character that you love does something that makes you go, it's like seeing your own mom do something that you, whoa.
And in the process of writing, a lot of the fun of it is finding those moments where the characters surprise you. That you go into it thinking, well, this is going to happen this way, and it's going to happen. But when you really dig into it, sometimes you'll get to that moment and go, no, it needs to go the other way. It needs to happen this way. And that's when the character is talking to you.
Yes.
I'm just interested in how you each got your start in this business, how it happened for you.
Hey, you want to start, Dan?
Yeah, I started out writing on live action shows. My first ever commission was a daytime soap opera episode in the UK on a show called Doctors, which was about a bunch of doctors. The BBC had a great titling department, being imaginative inside. And but I always wanted to do animation, because then you can do the lasers and the giants and the dragons instead of, oh, how are we feeling today? Have some pills. So I wrote for some live action shows, and then there was in Europe there was a development program where you could apply and try to get in. And I guess the equivalent here would be something like the Nickelodeon Writing Fellowship or the Disney Fellowship, one of those programs which is to take people who maybe haven't done animation professionally before and kind of coach them up. So I go on one of those programs, and that led to my first gig. But it's hard. It's hard getting gigs. This is very somewhere out there, which I'm determined to discover. There's a parallel reality where there's loads of writing gigs and very few writing. No, I don't want to do that. Very few people wanting to do it. But
I was in that reality.
You were in that, right?
I was.
That was called the 80s.
Yes, actually.
But the one we're in now, it's hard. There's a lot of people wanting to do it, chasing the jobs. But I got started through one of those programs.
Yeah. I'm going to give us a fairly lengthy answer to this, but hopefully not too long. When I was in the 8th grade, I got an assignment to write a piece on somebody that I admired. And so I did it on Stan Lee. I was really into reading comics at that point. And I wrote to Stan Lee and said, can you tell me something about yourself? I'm writing this paper. And he wrote back to me. And that sort of put off the light bulb in my head that, wow, this is something that you can actually do. Somebody actually does this for a living. And I tucked that away in the back of my head and, continued reading comic books and watching cartoons. I tried doing animation when I was in college. And then I studied cinematography, which had nothing to do with animation. And when I got out, I was looking for a job. Couldn't find anything, and I ran into a friend of mine who said, well, can you draw? I know this animation house out in Reseda that's looking for some people to do storyboards. And I was like, yeah, I can draw. And so I started doing storyboards for Filmation. And this was a period of time when nobody wanted to get into animation. Nobody wanted to get into animation. And the business was made up of people who had been in the animation business for 40 years. They were getting ready to retire. And there were a whole bunch of opportunities for young people to come in and learn the business from the ground up. And so that's how I got into it. And after doing storyboards for a few years, I got tired of trying to make really crappy scripts work. And I thought, I can do better than that. And so I switched over to writing scripts and have been doing that ever since.
Okay, and what you'll find is that everyone's story is completely different. And I'll try to briefly tell you mine, which is that as I said, I started out in publicity and licensing in live action motion pictures, although I did work on The Black Cauldron, the one animated picture I worked on for publicity. But I wanted to get into something that was more directly creative. There were creative elements to what I did, but it wasn't as creative as I wanted to be, and I didn't want to spend as much time having meetings with lawyers and attorneys, or lawyers and accountants. And a friend of mine had just been hired to do the Real Ghostbusters show. And that was at a time when we used to get orders of 65 half hours, which is unheard of today. But when you have 65 half hours that you need to do, you need to hire a lot of writers, and you have time to take a chance on new writers because their script doesn't work out, it needs to be rewritten. You have some room to move that episode towards the back and rewrite it. Anyway, he gave me an opportunity on The Real Ghostbusters. I wrote an episode which they liked. It ended up being, back in the days of videotape, it was the title episode on their first home video release. Yeah, didn't give me any more money, but at least I have a box that has the title of my episode on it. And they bought 2 more scripts from me that first season of Real Ghostbusters, and I moved on to another show called The Bionic 6, where I wrote 10 episodes, and then just kept going from there. But everyone starts out differently. No 2 people have the same break-in story. They're in the back.
When it comes to making that transition from, say, The Real Ghostbusters to Bionic 6, how do you get to know those characters? That's like if you're writing and you go for a job and you get it, you're there for 3 years. And then instantly going into another job, but you don't know the characters, you've never seen the show.
Well, first, you're not going to be there for 3 years.
Right.
Not these days.
Well, not these days, but...
Well, first, writing in television animation, if you're writing daytime, you're typically being hired 1 script at a time as a writer. If you're hired to be the story editor, you'll be there over the length of the series. But for the most part, writers are hired 1 or maybe 5 scripts on a big order show. You're not put on staff. There are a couple companies that have staffs, but they're very few and the staffs are small. So that's not terribly likely. And every show has a show Bible that talks about all the characters, their relationships, the world they're living in, and that's there to get you introduced and find out about who the characters are. And there's usually artwork, unless you're brought in very early, there'll be artwork so you can see what the characters look like.
Yeah, it's up to you as the writer to do your homework on these things. That it's, like you said, there's a Bible. If it's a show that's been on a while, you can usually find episodes online. You need to watch them all. I worked on a show recently that had a sort of serialized storytelling in it. And I had to read 26, 30 scripts front to back on it so that I understood exactly where those characters were when it came time to do my episode. And I ended up only doing 1 episode of that, but I still needed to put in that work to understand that show inside and out.
Yeah, you watch the show. Right? Well, I once, this producer, he had this series of 26 episodes, which hadn't made as much money as he wanted, so he now wanted to make a feature-length TV movie, but not doing any more animation, just picking out bits from the series. So I watched the 26 eps, writing down what happened, like a good little boy, writing down what happened in each one, and then pulling it, all right, well, maybe the story, let's take a bit of episode 18 and stick it on a bit of episode 9, and try and make a half-coherent story out of that, but it didn't really go anywhere. But I was a good boy, I watched the 26 episodes.
Yes. Yeah. We'll try to get to as many of you as possible.
You mentioned the show Bible, and I was wondering if that also covers areas of taboo for a character. So, like, for instance, Fred might hit Barney over the head with a large rock, and it's okay. But Fred would never drive over Barney with his car. So I know that there
I can tell you that probably it's never okay for Fred to hit Barney with a rock.
Well, he's hit with a newspaper, which is made of rock.
Yeah.
You know? So, I mean, there's things that are acceptable for cartoon characters to do.
That usually comes in under standards and practices that you won't, unless it's like a preschool show or something like that where they have very specific sort of things that they want to try and avoid or go into, that won't be enumerated in the show Bible. You know, if it's creating a world that's a science fiction world or something like that, they may go out of their way to describe that these blasters are not guns, that they are plasma blasters that act this way and stuff like that.
I did that with Stargate Infinity, which probably none of you ever saw. It was we did 22 or 26 half hours. It was another Stargate spin-off, which halfway through the series we threw out half the stuff that the people who developed the show had come up with because it wasn't working. But we got a lot of flack from standards and practices about them firing blasters at anything. I did one episode with monsters attacking a village, and they fired their blasters at the monsters, who were had generated an electronic field that kept the blasters from hitting them, and we still got complaints from standards and practices that we were shooting at. We're going, they're monsters, they're trying to kill people, and we're only annoying them.
But in answer to your question, that sort of limitation is not usually built into the Bible. It is something that is sort of like agreed upon in negotiation between the production company and the network standards and practices department, and then that information is disseminated.
Right, but if there's something that is unusual that you can't do, you can't drink the water, they'll tell you. And if there's something that isn't given to you and you put it in, they'll tell you, no, we can't do that. That'll just come up.
It's an interesting area. Like in Sabrina, they don't want us. You can do magic with your wand, you can do magic with your hands, but we don't want like people drinking potions because like kids might start copying, mixing weird stuff together and drinking it.
Yeah, well, that's a big thing in animation, especially as you skew younger audiences. Imitatable behavior. Something a kid might do to imitate the character, you can't have the characters do.
I was writing for a really cutesy show with Australian characters called the Koala Brothers, and it was for the BBC in Britain, and it was going to be on Disney Channel over here. And in one episode, some people were hitting tennis balls around, and they made a real mess of the place. And so I was like, wow, this place looks like it's been hit by a hurricane. And Disney didn't want the word hurricane in case somebody might have had a real hurricane and be really traumatized by it recently. So if you go, wow, this place looks like it's been hit by a windstorm. And at the time I thought, oh, Disney were a bunch of idiots in a hurricane. But then Katrina happened and maybe a bunch of people were traumatized and watching an episode of the Koala Brothers would have just sent them right back.
Those people wouldn't have TVs. They would have been destroyed in the hurricane.
I usually find it sort of works the opposite direction, which is that you'll have a script and something will happen in the news, and they'll all freak out and go, oh no, God, you can't have that happen right now. And you say, okay, I'll change it, and you do. And then, because of the way the production process works, it's 9 months, a year later, and by the time the show actually comes out, people have completely forgotten about whatever that incident was.
Mm. And it's different in different countries. Like, one of the things I love about animation is it travels really well. It goes all over the world because essentially the story is happening visually and it's vivid, and that works across languages and across cultures. So in Britain and America, we're pretty squeaky clean. We're really scared of traumatizing our kids or exposing themselves to bad things that they might do. Other countries are like, Japanese cartoon Shin-chan, the dad hits the kid on the head and a bump comes up right on his head and everyone starts laughing. Man, that's child abuse, right? my wife with whom I write, she's from Spain, and in the 80s, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were huge, and their battle cry was "Cowabunga," yeah? Like, "Cowabunga, dude!" Well, in the Spanish dubbing, OMG, they said, they didn't say "Cowabunga," they said "Te puta madre," which, if you know Spanish, it's really, really bad. The B-word puta is basically a prostitute, and so it's like these standards and practices really vary from culture to culture.
Okay, yes.
So you mentioned that you had studied cinematography in college, but it was nowhere in your realm where you ended up doing your work. So as a focus on animation, what would you say would be a good focus in college? Other than English, obviously, for writing.
I would say that you would want to learn whatever inspires you. You know, wherever your passion takes you. You know, you can't say that there's one path to it. You know, a good example is that the guy who created SpongeBob has a background in marine biology. And, you know, that's a sort of long, roundabout way of getting there, but you have to be very successful with that. But if you're going to be a writer of any sort, it's good to have a broad base of knowledge to know a lot about a lot of things.
Absolutely.
And I think to like focus on, you know, I'm going to learn this one thing would be self-defeating.
Yeah, I can't add to that. Learn as much as you can about stuff. No one cares what degree you have when it comes to working in the animation industry. It's what can you deliver? What, you know, are you a good writer? Are you a good artist? Are you a good whatever? That's what people care about. Degrees, meaningless.
And do you play well with others?
Yeah.
That's important.
And get yourself in the room. You know, it's amazing, you know, we've now got Skype and email. We were so connected by electronic, we don't actually need to talk to each other. And yet people still buy people. So if you get in the room in some form or other inside the company, even if you got hired as the person to restock the fridge with snacks.
That's exactly what I was telling them. I could just sweep the floor, do whatever.
If you're in there and then you're doing it with a smile on your face and you're super enthusiastic and you're the best fridge stocker that they've ever had, then you're in the room and you hear when there are opportunities and people like you already. That's kind of half the battle.
You know, there's 1,000 people looking for every job. If you're already there and they know you, you know who to talk to, and they're willing to talk to you because you're there. So if you can get a job in the industry, it is a leg up. It doesn't guarantee anything. No one's guaranteed anything. But it's access. It's all about who you know. They're not going to hire you because they know you, but they'll at least talk to you and maybe look at your stuff. I want to go to people who haven't asked a question.
That guy against the wall.
Yeah, okay.
The people that write live action movies are saying like they're writing a script and they have to kind of think budgetary terms, like if a scene has too many extras or too many things going on, they have to kind of think like, well, then I'm not going to write a scene with big extras, a lot of extras. So do you kind of have to think about things like that too?
Absolutely. And different shows have different ways they calculate their budget. I've been on shows where you couldn't change the characters' costumes. Well, they're not really costumes because they're drawn, but you couldn't have them wear lots of different clothes because every time you do,
yeah.
I mean, people think, well, it's a cartoon, everything, nothing costs money. Well, you have to draw everything, which means you have to design everything. So you have to hire someone. If someone's going to pick up a microphone, someone has to design the microphone so it looks like everything else in the world of that show. So everything costs money. And some shows say this many costume changes. I worked on other shows, it was voice actors. You could hire this many actors per episode. And you know, a lot of the shows you work so that you get the money is averaged out. So if we can have fewer costume changes in this episode, we can have more later. And the shows will tell you what their budget requirements.
Yes, but one of the reasons why we work in animation is because our imaginations are not fettered, and you don't want to put those blinkers on yourself before you start.
Right.
And so you want to try and tell the best story that you can in the way that it wants to be told. And then if they come back to you in production and say, "Oh God, we can't do that," then you scale it back. But don't censor yourself before you start.
Okay.
Yes, I have a couple questions. Who exactly is in charge of the show Bible and its management practices within the industry?
Show Bibles are written, if you're creating an original show, you're writing the show Bible. That's part of how you're pitching it. Other times, the company hires someone like me, I do a lot of it, to write a show Bible, to come up with who the characters are. Look, I didn't develop Transformers, but we'll use that as an example. Transformers were a set of 8 toy robots that, there may not even be 8 in the toy line, they've only been 6, but that converted from robots to cars. Someone was hired to say, make this a TV show. And they came up with 8 or 12 or how many Transformers were in an original 8, and who their personalities are and why they were in conflict, who were the good guys, who were the bad guys, what the universe was, who the non-Transformer characters were, all that kind of stuff. That's what goes into the show Bible. And it's either you for a show you're creating or the company hires someone to do it. And what was the second part?
Yes, who exactly runs the management practices?
That's the network side. That they have people on the networks who supervise the shows. You know, they buy the show, then they put it into their sort of current production thing, and they've got people who are looking at, you know, to make sure that the quality is up to, you know, the quality that they want, and that it's not crossing any sort of lines. And they're sort of administrators that we have to deal with.
And some networks will have a slightly more squeaky clean. Like Disney will be a little bit more cautious than Nickelodeon. I mean, Nickelodeon will still draw a line somewhere. But yeah, the channel will have it.
And every now and then it surprises you. The most violent show I've ever worked on was the Smurfs. Yeah, when I went to write the Smurfs, I'd been writing action-adventure stuff, and I needed the Smurfs in this episode to wake up a sleeping Gargamel. Gargamel was the bad guy, for those of you who don't know the Smurfs.
Not know the Smurfs?
Don't remember the character names. But Gargamel was out in the woods sleeping with his head on a hollow log, and I wrote the scenes that they throw a rock at the far end of the log that hits the log, and the log starts vibrating, and the vibration moves along the log and gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it flings Gargamel up in the air, etc. And they came back to me and said, why don't you just have them hit him in the head with the rock? Trust me, there was no superhero show where I could hit someone in the head with a rock. Yes.
I'd just like to know about your writing processes, specifically, Dan, your writing process with your partner and your wife.
Yeah, well, you sometimes see TV shows where, like, the husband and wife are sitting across and, like, saying the dialogue to each other. Well, we don't do that. I think we'd kill each other if we tried. So what we do is, like, we'll, like, be together at a and other people probably, I don't know what people do in their own bedroom when they're writing, but we'll be, like, be at the desk and we'll be working out the story. What if she does this? And then, okay, so in the first part of the script, they'll do this. So we'll work out the story together. And then we'll go our separate ways, and one of us will go and write it up, either as an outline, if we're at that stage, or as a script, and then show it to the other one. And so it's like the other one's kind of acting as a script editor on the first one. So we're like together, apart, and we see things the other person doesn't see. Like, and so you know, I wish I could write amazing by myself, and probably she wishes she could do it by herself. But we don't seem to be. We seem to do better with two. But all writing partnerships, right? It's kind of a marriage, even if the people are not actually married. And it always works differently. So we're working, beating out the story together, and then apart and commenting, and it means that everything has to get past 2 sets of eyes before it'll go out. I can think my joke is awesome, and the good thing about being married is like we got that she doesn't have to be polite. So no, you're not as funny as you think you are, sweetie. So we do that. That's how we do it.
Yeah, and writing for animation is a very collaborative process that if you're a freelance writer, you're working with a story editor who's going to be giving you directions on, how to make the story fit into the overall picture of the series that they're trying to do. So there's a lot of discussions back and forth, whether you're sitting down in the room and breaking the story, or whether you're, they just say, go write an outline, but keep these things in mind. And then you go sort of back and forth. You get notes, you revise it, and there's a lot of revising that goes along. And so you have to be really good at dealing with people, because nobody has time to deal with jerks.
Yeah. I mostly write by myself, but over the years I've written a number of things with different partners, and it works every different way. One partner and I, we would talk out the general story, and then one of us would sit down at the computer and write it out in detail until they hit a point where they weren't sure, and then we'd swap. And we were in the room together, and I would go and sit down, and I'd rewrite the first part that he'd written and write the next chunk, and then we'd switch again. Another partner and I, we talked out the whole thing, we sketched out the outline, and then we went to our separate homes, and he wrote the first half and I wrote the second half, or vice versa, and then we'd swap at the end.
You wrote the second half while he was writing the first?
Yeah. After the outline had been worked out. So you can do it. You can say, this will happen in the middle, and we know where they're going to end up. So just go and do it. But better to have at least a simple outline, if not a detailed outline, when you're doing that.
And wherever you're working in the industry, if you're not writing by yourself in your bedroom, you are collaborating with somebody. It could be the script editor or the showrunner, or it could be the studio. So you got to learn how to play in the sandbox. And part of it is kind of acting. So someone says, "Oh, let's change the story so that Act 3 is like in the supermarket instead of in the castle." And inside, you're like, "This person's just tearing the head off my baby, and I want to go around and smash them up." That's interesting. Let me think about that. That's a good phrase to have.
Let me think about that. Is good.
Let me think about it.
Your styles have to work together. I mean, I've worked with several partners at different times. My wife and I tried to work together. Not possible. I have an idea for the story, and I know it's going to hit these points, and it goes, and maybe I'll make a left turn suddenly. My wife needs to know every single point of the story, and you can't make it up as you go along. You have to know what it is while you're writing it. There's no improvisation in that regard, and we just could not work together. So.
Yeah, learning how to play with others while keeping that passion and excitement. If you don't care about it, we just.
Well, but it's also the way you come up with the stories, the way you work. You have to meld together. Every two people can't work together because their styles are different. We're down to the last 5 minutes, so we'll try to do very quick answers to questions. You and Green,
if you want to adapt a novel into animation, what's the best way to do it?
A gentleman asked, what's the best way to do animation?
Best way to adopt a novel into animation. It depends whether you're trying to make it a feature film or a TV series. And there's also a question of how much work you want to do before you have some interest. Like writing a whole feature script is a lot of work. So it's a lot of work to write 90, 100 pages and then find out that nobody's interested. So
do you have the rights to it?
Yeah. Whose novel is it? Like if the novel belongs to someone else, you can't use it.
Also, feature films, theatrical feature films, typically work in a different method. There will be a script, and then it goes to the board artist, will each be given a chunk, a scene, to board and to rewrite as they're boarding, and then the director and the writers and the board artists will all get together and go over each sequence and decide what works, what doesn't work, and the writer goes back and writes a new script and keeps incorporating this, and this it goes through many, many different iterations, over and over and over again. Television, I mean, sometimes with direct-to-video features, it may be done the same way as television, which is the writer writes the script, and after the executives give you your notes, they just go to boarding and they board it more or less as you wrote it. But it's a different process. One other thing I want to say is titles. In live action television, producers, all those people with producer titles are writers, except for the one that says produced by. But they're all writers. And the story editor is one of the lowest people on the writing chain on a live action TV show. In animation, the story editor is the senior writer. They're the head writer. They're generally running the show. The producers are all executives. They are not writers for the most part. So it's a terminology that a lot of people have trouble with. Are we out of time? Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. We're out of time.
I'm going to hang around outside for a bit if anyone...
This was a production of Secret City Geek Lab on KTSTFM.com. We broadcast every Wednesday at 7 o'clock p.m. Visit the Geek Lab at secretcitycomedy.com/geeklab or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/secretcity.